This webinar will be recorded, and any questions that are asked during the webinar will be recorded as well. The webinar is also open to the press, so consider everything that is said today to be on the record as well. If you see on the left side of your screen, there will be a section with a question mark above it that says Q&A. There are no open phone lines for this, so please type your questions into the Q&A section and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. So we will be monitoring your questions as they go through, but reminder that all answers to these questions will be provided at the end of the webinar. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Engage Cuba President James Williams.
Okay, good morning. Thank you everybody for joining us today and doing what we love to do, webinars. And I hope this is going to be informative for everyone on this call. We're going to do a few things here. One, I'm going to do sort of a brief overview on some of the changes that were announced over the last few weeks related to Cuba policy, particularly from Secretary Pompeo and National Security Advisor Bolton, talk about what some of the implications for those are, and then talk about some of the areas for engagement in spite of this process. And hopefully, we'll see some opportunities to influence or at least advocate during this process because it's essential to the future of U.S.-Cuba relations for American interests and for the betterment of the Cuban people. So most of you who are on this line probably already know about Engage Cuba, but for the few of you who do not, we are the big tent coalition of private companies, organizations, state and local leaders, human rights, and Cuban Americans who are working for a policy of engagement with Cuba. That includes a full lift in the embargo, but also piecemeal approaches to advance both legislation and regulatory change to both advance American interests and empower the Cuban people. We do that through advocacy on Capitol Hill, the administration, our state council network of over 18 states around the country who are advocating for a policy of engagement in American interests, media, business analysis, amongst other things. So thank you to everyone who's a part of us. If you want to get more involved, please let us know. We'd love to have you. And with that, let's turn to the recent announcements. So on April 17th, we had two announcements on the same day. In the morning, we had Secretary Pompeo come out of the State Department and announce the activation of Titles 3 and 4 of the Helms-Burton Act. The legislation passed in the mid-90s, of which codified much of what we consider the embargo, sanctions, and within that, which I will get into in much greater detail in a minute, were some of the most important changes announced that day, unprecedented changes. Then later in the day, National Security Advisor Bolton was in Miami, and he gave a speech where he announced a subsequent series of changes to U.S.-Cuba policy, including a cap on the limit on remittances, elimination on U-turn transactions. He added 5 new additions to the Cuba restricted list and made allusions to restrictions on non-family travel for U.S. persons. So let's jump right into these in a little more detail. So Titles 3 and 4 of Helms-Burton, some very wonky and complicated language, but in short, really what it allows Americans to do, and this was passed in 1996, it has never been implemented before. It was always seen by both the Clinton, Bush, and Obama, and then early Trump administration as an extreme step that was reviled by America's closest allies. And so for the longest time, we have never taken this step. With the new regime in charge here, they have decided to move forward with it, which means that Americans, and now Americans in 2 buckets of groups, both Americans who were Americans at the time of the revolution and had their property expropriated, and Cubans who were not American citizens at that time but have since gained legal status in the United States, are now able to sue foreign companies. And when I say foreign, that means includes American companies, which they probably did not really perceive at the time was going to be part of the liability of this. European, Canadian, Mexican, our closest allies in the country for quote-unquote trafficking in those properties. 1,913 claims that were for American citizens at the time, of which we have a register of all those claims. They're recognized between the countries as credible and legitimate and something that needs to be arbitrated. The process for doing that has not been easy and been politically tense. It started somewhat in earnest in the Obama administration. There were a few rounds of dialogue with the Cubans on setting up a process to negotiate those claims, as Cuba has done with many other countries around the world. But obviously that did not advance too far. And under this step, that looks extremely unlikely. The second bucket of claims is what we call uncertified claims, and that is, Cubans who were not U.S. citizens at the time, who have since gained legal status in the U.S., who can now sue similarly under the U.S. court system. This is really unprecedented in international law and in the United States. You could imagine if we applied this standard to other countries around the world, what that would mean. If any sort of civil conflict in a country that those citizens then have since moved to the United States, we would use our court system to grant them retroactive rights that they didn't have at the time. We'd be in lawsuits with virtually every country in the world. And within that, there's also Title IV, which got a little less fanfare, but is important nonetheless. It's a policy that extends really the punitive measure on folks who are perceived to be trafficking in properties and denies them and their executives and shareholders access to enter the United States. Most famously, this is the case for some executives of the Canadian mining company Sherritt currently. So we talked a little about this, but what could this mean? What are the consequences? Obviously, there is an immediate cost to U.S. businesses and a limiting and sort of chilling effect in the environment for future business. There are companies that are currently doing business in Cuba who are anxious and nervous about what this means for them now. And then there are companies who may be looking to do business in Cuba in the future who see this legal liability and uncertainty as a complication for their business that may decide them to do business elsewhere, which is, of course, is part of the strategy in implementing these in the first place. It would, very importantly and extremely urgent now, it would complicate the U.S. strategy vis-a-vis Venezuela. This policy has never been enacted before, as I said, because of the strenuous objections of our closest allies who are essential in resolving the situation in Venezuela. And so picking a what we consider a needless fight, but certainly, a very contentious one at that, with our closest allies who we are working with hand in glove to try to resolve differences in Venezuela and isolate the Maduro regime, is at, a minimum complicated through this contentious action. As I said, it strains relations with our closest allies. We're going to be suing our closest friends, and you're already starting to see that play out in the press, where you've had the governments in Mexico, Spain, Canada, and others, denounce this vigorously. It gives a vacuum for our closest, our fiercest adversaries in Russia, China, and abroad, who, as the U.S. and our Western countries, are limited in their space of pushing for reform and influence in Cuba. It opens up a vacuum for others to fill it, and we've seen that, around the world, but also particularly in places like Venezuela and Cuba in recent years. And then, really importantly, and we're seeing this play out very, very vividly in the last 24 hours, when the United States really, this is, almost a nuclear weapon, a nuclear option.
Thank you.
Doing something that every administration before has seemed so extreme. It limits civil society and space for internal political and civic debate in Cuba. One of the sort of rare bright spots in Cuban civil society has been advancements in LGBT rights, and that's been an area that Cuba's received a lot of praise. given its dark history on the issue. And just in the last 24 hours, Cuba has canceled its annual LGBT and campaign against homophobia and transphobia march or parade that they do every year, citing increased U.S. hostilities and anxiety around this being used as a way to destabilize the Cuban government by their enemies in Miami and elsewhere. Obviously, we disagree with that sentiment and strongly condemn those actions, but it is a predictable series of events, and we've seen this time and time again. When the United States tightens up, so does the space in Cuba. Now let's move on to some of the other sanctions that were announced by National Security Advisor Bolton later that day in Miami. One of them, an extremely important one, was a limit on the amount of money Americans can send via remittances to individual Cuban citizens and organizations in Cuba. This has been a topic that was sort of debated heatedly during the Bush administration, and it had restrictions on it. And then under the Obama administration, they eventually fully lifted the cap on remittance, the amount of money Americans can send to Cuban nationals in Cuba. So this was used both to, from the very sort of bare necessities of supporting your family and friends with humanitarian exemptions.
Dial in, but apparently we're getting some feedback. Please mute your phones if you're on the line.
Okay, well, hopefully you can all hear me all right. And apologies if there's any issues there. So the Obama administration lifted this entire limit on that, and this was a really catalytic effect for both Cuban citizens and the Cuban economy, especially the Cuban private sector, who relied on remittance channels, both financial and products, to start, grow, and expand and successfully run their new private businesses. This is something that really seems cruel. We don't really understand fundamentally why we should be, if you're trying to punish the Cuban government, why limiting the amount of money that individual and everyday Cubans can get from their family, friends, and business associates is appropriate and in the U.S. and Cuban national interest. So this is an area we want to return to later, but certainly a really disappointing change, and that seems to run counter to the spirit of what the president's own policy claims to be. There's also an end to what they call U-turn transactions, which is basically funds that transfer through the U.S. financial system or in U.S. dollars that are no longer going to be authorized if a Cuban entity is party to the transaction. This has had sort of limited impact in direct American transactions here. It hasn't really got off the ground, particularly successfully under the Obama administration, but has been nonetheless a challenge for Cuban banking and the ability for Cuba to really flourish and succeed in the global economy. They added an additional 5 new entities to what they call the restricted list. Most of them were just kind of, I'd say, housekeeping updates. A couple new hotels, and this Gaviota airline, which is obviously under Gaviota. A change, but not a particularly significant one. And then this is the area, I think, where things get really, really interesting and really, really damaging. Advisor Bolton announced that they intend to enact a policy to restrict all non-family travel, so non-Cuban family travel, and criticizing what they called veiled tourism. So most of you on the line know there are these 12 categories of purposeful travel of which Americans are able to travel to in Cuba. One of those is for family travel, and so that allows Cuban Americans to visit their family and friends, their family, unfettered, under a general license. And then there are these 11 other categories, which include things like academic, religious, humanitarian, support for the Cuban people, professional research and meetings. And then there's one other particularly important category where a lot of the travel is happening, and that's under the educational travel category for people-to-people travel. So this is where the category that most of the cruise lines are using, a lot of the large tour groups that are going down there, and it really makes up a bulk of this. And there's been a criticism from hardliners in the United States that this is not meaningful interaction with the Cuban people, that this is sort of, tourism dressed up as a people-to-people exchange, and as part of a plan and a campaign to either totally eliminate or very severely limit that category of travel, Advisor Bolton announced these changes. But importantly, what we saw through this is normally when you have announcements coming out of an administration, including the Trump administration previously on Cuba when they had an announcement back in June of 2017, when a speech like this is announced, it's after it's gone through an interagency process where after the speech there's an announcement of what the regulatory changes are going to be that were implicated in the speech. Importantly, this did not happen in this case, either because they weren't prepared, because they were worried about things leaking, or there wasn't a consensus internally amongst the agencies and departments that are working on this and the different stakeholders that this was the right thing to do, and they were trying to position this ahead of some of the other departments. We don't know for sure, but it is a really, really critical point, which means that these regs have not yet been written at the time of this speech. So that means there's opportunities for engagement around them because their interpretations of how they decide with these categories could have significant impacts for U.S. travel and the U.S. travel industry, particularly the cruise lines. So let's jump right into that on opportunities for engagement in the now. So there's obviously the continued work that groups like Engage Cuba and others are doing to promote U.S.-Cuba relations, advance American interests, empower the Cuban people. But in response and sort of immediate reaction to Bolton's announcement and Pompeo's announcement, we wanted to highlight what we think are really two important areas where people can get active immediately. One is the travel regulatory change process in the Trump administration now that it actually has to write the rules. There is a lot of the language that Bolton used was, in some ways vague and really lose a lot of opportunity to interpret exactly what this means in practice. And so we think there's a lot of areas of where we could strengthen language that would really achieve a lot of the stated goals of what Advisor Bolton said, but that would not radically stop or curtail travel under the people-to-people license category. And this is really, really important because it is where the bulk of travel from the United States happens. We're seeing, there's this last week there was a tourism fair in Cuba, and the government mentioned, and these are the Cuban government stats, so, take them for what they're worth here, but they said that U.S. visitors are up 93% compared to the same period last year. The United States is now the second largest provider of international travels to Cuba, behind Canada. Of the 93%, the increase, 55% of those Americans arrived on cruises, and that was up 48% from last year. So this is the cruise line, especially, is a particularly rapid growing part of the U.S. travel industry to Cuba for a lot of reasons, as we know. One being, it's simpler, the compliance is easier, and it's, a trusted brand that American travelers know, respect, and are comfortable with. And then also that just tourism generally so far this year was up 7%, with apparently about over 2 million visitors already arriving in Cuba, with a goal of 5.1 million international visitors for all of 2019. So this really has high stakes. I'd say that in the end, this is going to be one of the areas where this change, when we finally get to the regulatory process, is going to be most important to see how this gets done. And we will strongly, strongly encourage people now, stakeholders, both from the travel industry, Americans, Cuban Americans, whoever, to be weighing in on this process. And we'll talk a little bit about how you can do that. Secondly, in a really important area that we think that there is some receptivity from the Trump administration to include some exemptions is around the limits on remittances. And so in the speech, it was just sort of a blanket statement around we're going to cap remittances to $1,000 a quarter from Americans to from U.S. citizens to Cubans on the island. We think there are some really strong arguments for why those limits are not just arbitrary but damaging for particular entities in Cuba that rely on these transactions. So that being, specifically the Cuban private sector, of which the Trump administration has repeatedly stated is a goal of U.S. policy to support, and then also, religious, humanitarian, and civil society organizations that are working on the ground in Cuba that, I think we all have sort of universal appeal from the United States, whether you're a hardliner or pro-engagement. And so we're hopeful, and we encourage everyone here to be pushing on that as well, because we want to continue to both support these important change agents in Cuba and elements of Cuban society on the ground who are not caught as collateral damage in this broader dispute. So how do we do this? How do we get involved? How can you get involved? What are we doing here at Engage Cuba? Obviously, most importantly is talking to officials in the Trump administration. If you have not done so already, we strongly encourage you to reach out, both at the State Department, the Cuba desk, Western Hemisphere office. They are taking feedback from stakeholders, both from the business community, the Cuban American community, religious, civil society, you name it. That type of feedback right now is really important. If you have other relationships and contacts within the Trump administration, they don't necessarily have to be directly relevant and related to Cuba policy itself. All sort of engagement right now matters. As we know, this is not, the Trump administration is not sort of the organizational structure and strategy deliberative process that we've come accustomed to in the past under other administrations. Is very ad hoc. And so you never know what kind of conversation or meeting will break through. And so with that being said, contacts at the Treasury Department, the White House, obviously, the political shop, NSC, Department of Defense, Commerce, you name it, we really encourage you to reach out and make this clear that this is important, to you, to your stakeholders, and to the American interest. While Congress does not have a direct role, obviously, in writing these regulations, they do have an important role to play in oversight and educating and influencing what the Trump administration will inevitably do. And so, in addition to reaching out to any contacts or players you have in the Trump administration, I would also strongly encourage people to reach out to your members of Congress, either in district or in D.C., staff, and then also relevant, members of Congress that you think for your area. So if they're the leader of a travel caucus or a relevant committee that oversees this, certainly you need to let them know, because, there's a lot of really, really pressing and important issues going on. We know there's a high level of dysfunction generally in Washington, and so, we cannot let kind of inertia continue to be the force here, given all the importance around this topic. So really being active now matters, especially as this regulatory process is heavily underway. And then, of course, we want you to be active publicly. So, writing letters to the editor, sharing things on social media, writing op-eds, telling friends and family to get involved. And then if you have others in your network that you think would love to get more involved at the state, national, or local level in our work, or just generally on U.S.-Cuba policy, one, please do so, and two, if we can be helpful in that, we'd love to be. And in any way we can, that's what we're here for. And then just finally, before I open this up for questions, one, I am not a lawyer. This is not your legal advice. So that is a disclaimer to any companies or organizations who are concerned about what some of these changes might mean for their business, whether that's the Title III lawsuits or travel policy. But I think it's really important that people understand that these rules have not changed yet on travel. And so right now it's, if you have bookings, it's business as usual. You can have comfort in that. These rules have not changed. We don't know what they will fully change to. But also, and I think equally as important, this is the opportunity now to get involved and try to influence and educate that process on why there are areas that should be carved out that allow for people-to-people travel, that allow for support for the Cuban people travel to continue. It's good for the United States, and it's good for the Cuban people. So with that, I will turn it over to questions. And please type in your questions, and we will read them out here for everyone and answer them to the best of our ability.
All right. Please, again, use the Q&A section on the left-hand panel and type in your questions, and then we'll answer them directly.
Okay. All right. First one here. Do you foresee the Trump administration keeping the business meetings professional research exception to the travel ban? So, great question. So as folks know, and what he's alluding to in this question is there's these 12 categories of travel, one of which is professional research and meetings, and that is what most folks are using when they're traveling down there, either from the corporate side to do meetings either with the Cuban government or Cuban private sector companies. We anticipate that will continue. We have not heard explicitly that license, will be exempt 100%. Obviously, with this administration, what you hear today and what you hear tomorrow are not always the same thing. But really, the target of this is the category of people-to-people. That's the big area that I think is most vulnerable to change and has the most significant impact. And so we certainly want to press the administration and reiterate the importance of that category, because that is certainly not veiled tourism. If you're even trying to make that argument and see their point of view on this, you're doing exactly what that category is supposed to be doing under the law. And so, I think we need to make that clear, but I think of the things that are on the chopping block, that is less likely comparative to receive changes than others. Okay. Let's see. Okay, hold on. Does Engage Cuba schedule Hill Day visits? So we're just going through all these. A lot of questions, so thank you. Yes, we do. And, we have both sort of things we're doing on a consistent basis and then more regular, larger group things. And so we will be following up, I think, with more information on that moving forward as things come together. But we strongly also encourage folks, if they're coming to Washington for any purpose, let us know in advance, and we'd love to work with you on seeing your either local delegation or other folks here and giving you, information, talking points, whatever we think is useful. We have, what is the status of the Freedom to Travel to Cuba Act? So this is the legislation that's been introduced every year that fully lifts the travel ban on Cuba for Americans. It previously had Senator Flake, who is obviously no longer in Congress, and Senator Leahy in the Senate. It has passed twice through the Senate process through appropriations. So in 2015 and 2016, we saw that pass. And so it's a bill that had a lot of bipartisan support. It is planned on being introduced in the near term, reintroduced for this Congress. Obviously, every Congress we have to reintroduce it. And so we're in a position now where we encourage strongly for everyone to be contacting their member of Congress, both in the House and Senate, encouraging them to support this legislation. In terms of substance, the legislation will be virtually identical to the substance in years past. And I think, more than anything, it's an important marker that shows this deep bipartisan support that does exist for not limiting Americans' ability to travel as a fundamental right as citizens. So there's a good question here, and I'm going to have to say that, I am not a lawyer on this, but I'll answer to the best of my ability. Saying, is there any direct connection between Title IV travel bans and claims brought under Title III, or do those two provisions function independently? So what the administration has said has been around that, Title III has gone into effect. As of May 2nd, there is now 3 suits that, we have seen against American companies and one by American company against a Cuban state company. That the Title IV, so that can, that is open and that can happen. But the Title IV process it's not that something kind of turned on. It's an active decision that the administration says it will start to look at and investigate areas of doing that. So, for example, just as far as I know, and maybe I can be corrected here, just because someone can be sued under Title III, that does not trigger Title IV. That's a decision because it's private citizens who are making the decision on Title III to bring a suit with their own calculations. Title IV is a decision by the U.S. Government, of which they are going to evaluate under their own criteria. And so, that's been something that we have not seen a lot of action on yet from the administration. In the Sherritt case, it's been one that's happened, but it has not happened in many other cases. And we think they're going to be. We don't really know exactly how vigorously and aggressively the Trump administration is going to utilize that tool, but we'll see moving forward. But we don't see them as particularly or explicitly connected. Okay, let's see here. So does Title III affect companies that already have a license with the U.S. to do business with Cuba? Well, this is a really interesting dynamic and an interesting question, because at the time of the law was written, it really wasn't foreseen that there would be American companies operating on the island that would be the target of these lawsuits. So there was very strict criteria of who can bring lawsuits and of which type, right? So you had to have a certain type of property in Cuba. It couldn't be valued under less than $50,000. It couldn't be a residential property. And there's an important exemption and language in here, which this has never been tested, so we don't know how this is going to be interpreted by the courts, but that there's an exemption for purposeful travel, lawful purposeful travel to Cuba. So, there's a statement put out by the Cruise Line Industry Association, I think that's shared by a lot of others, which is, there's a specific language in the law that says, incident to purposeful travel is exempt. And so the travel industry, I think, is hanging a legal justification, I think, soundly on that. But also that more generally, that this business all these businesses were approved under U.S. law. These were things either they got a specific license or in most cases, the Trump administration. They've let this go on for years. And so is it really fair to then turn around, and punish them when they're the ones that have the permission under their own current regulatory regime? We're going to see how that plays out. Frankly, we do not know exactly how judges will interpret it. And we also don't know if the rulings will be consistent from claim to claim. And so, depending on where the jurisdiction these get filed, obviously a lot of them will be in South Florida, but not exclusively. Time will tell. Do you think it's likely possible that the support for the Cuban people travel category will be eliminated or become more restrictive? Like with the people-to-people category under education, I think support for the Cuban people is the other area that I think has is most in the crosshairs in terms of whether it will be sort of moved to a specific license or the criteria of what meets it, which is in somewhat vague language, will be redefined. I think we're optimistic that this is an area that will not be eliminated. I think there's really important work that happens within that category, and it's our inclination and the effort to push to sort of make that category clearer on what qualifies and wanting to include specifically language related to supporting the Cuban private sector. which was mentioned and sort of touched on in the last round of regulatory changes that the Trump administration did. And there was an FAQ put out, I think, by Treasury talking about certain things that are incident to that, but it didn't really spell it out super explicitly. So I would think that that's going to be a category that is debated fiercely internally on what to do and how to define it. You know, we're hopeful that it will not be eliminated, or at least, you know, really narrowly licensed in its definition. But, you know, that's something that I would strongly push on with the administration and your congressional allies now, because I think that is an area that's under significant debate internally. Is there a way of checking if a property can be sued to a claim from trafficking, like a database that identifies the expropriated areas? Man, that's a cool project. Unfortunately, there really is nothing like that. So remember, there's two buckets of claims. There are, you know, the American certified claimants, of which are all public and you can look up online. So those are 5,913. The Foreign Claims and Settlement Commission has a website. We can send that around afterwards. And so you can see who had the title, what it was, the valuation of it was. And so we do have a fair amount of insight and transparency, at least from the U.S. side, on who has the claims. That's in one bucket. On the second bucket, you know, we really don't, because this is, you know, people who were Cuban at the time. So the U.S. government doesn't have that record of what their property was specifically, who are now in the United States with, you know, U.S. legal rights. So, you know, they've estimated this up to, quote unquote, 200,000 possible claims as a result of this. You know, I don't think that's realistic. We think it'll be a much smaller number, as we've seen thus far, but we really don't know, one, where they were living. So it would make it almost impossible to map this out to know what could be subject to a claim and what couldn't be. Also, and importantly, in Cuba, you know, the government obviously knows about this law and saw it when it was coming in and protested it. So they're not particularly interested in making this information more publicly available either, to insulate themselves and their commercial partners from legal risk. And so, you know, between those two elements, the secondary on the uncertified claimants and the Cuban government not particularly wanting to broadcast that legal space and risk, we really don't. So it would be a very interesting sort of project that I think could be undertaken to try to capture some of this, but it would certainly be not exhaustive because there's a lot of information that's sort of unknowable, because we don't exactly know who will pop out of the woodwork with the claim, but we could certainly get a lot of it. And so maybe we can take that on, or maybe we recommend that become something for like a group project that others can work on. Yes, someone asked if we can send out a template or outline for a letter to the editor that we can then, you know, make our own. Absolutely. Thank you for putting that out there. Very, very happy. And then there's also a sort of a list of talking points and facts and figures for any conversations within their congressional districts or in DC. Yes, absolutely. We will share, you know, and please, obviously, you know, this is your own story. This is why this issue matters to you. But we can at least send some, you know, more generic points that you can use to sort of start to build on your case. This is a tough question coming from a really smart reporter, so I'll try to answer it the best I can. Why do you think Exxon, this is one of the companies that was doing, that filed a lawsuit, is suing Cuba if it seems impossible to get money from the country? And so ExxonMobil, as you all know, like, who has inherited a claim, a certified claim in Cuba from, you know, the time of expropriation. It is now being utilized by the Cuban state oil company, and they filed a claim for damages on that. That was, I think, a particularly one of the more surprising claims that's come out. You know, the ones that have been around about the ports have been bandied about in the press, you know, for 20 years, and were, you know, largely expected to be happening. This one, I think, was one of the more interesting ones. it's tough to say. I think more than anything, it seems like, and this is, just a personal opinion here, that it was part of a sort of working closely with the Trump administration and wanting to be seen as doing something helpful to them. And, I don't think you can totally separate Venezuela and Cuba in terms of Trump administration policies and what some of the sticks and carrots may be. You can read into that how you want. Let's see. Last week we were in Havana and we're told the U.S. Embassy in Cuba has resumed some services. Do Cubans still have to go to Mexico for U.S. visas? Well, we have extremely limited consular services at the embassy, a U.S. embassy in Havana, and as far as I know, in almost all cases, Cubans have to travel abroad to be able to a third-party country to be able to secure a visa in the United States. Whether that's Mexico, Guyana, Colombia, other places that they've tried to facilitate this, it's still an extremely laborious and difficult process. There are a lot of other options that the administration could take to try to at least deal with this backlog, because they could be flying consular officers in there for the day here and there. Obviously there are security concerns, but there's a lot more we could do, I think, to expedite this process and fulfill our obligations to the Cuban people, like we've claimed to want to uphold. There's also, this has led to some really challenging. Cubans have become now an extremely significant part of the asylum cases at the Mexican border, and I don't think that is particularly surprising given the dynamics that we're seeing here. So, questions. Is there any coordinated work being done among organizations involved in engagement with Cuba to influence the new measures? Yes, there's lots and lots of folks who are obviously monitoring this, watching this, and hoping to educate the Trump administration and Congress and others about its impact, but we need more. Right now, I think everybody sort of thinks, they sit around and watch something happen and think somebody else is going to be the one that calls 911 or the police, but realistically, we all need to be involved. And so do not assume that something else is happening or that it's sufficient, because it likely is not. And so now is not the time to hold back. If you, have limited time, limited bandwidth, let's get that get involved now, because, in a few months, that might be too late to influence this process. And so, we strongly, strongly encourage folks to get involved now. How does ending U-turn transactions affect agricultural trade or any type of trade with Cuba? I have to be frank with you guys here. I'm not enough of an expert on this to be able to tell you about the sort of broader trade dynamics of how the financial system works with U-turn transactions. What I've heard from folks in the financial industry in the United States is that in terms of like direct trade that we're doing with Cuba, it will have limited impact from the U.S. perspective. It's just something that has not, because of the sort of decades-long sanctions browbeating that's happened from U.S. administrations to the financial industry on Cuba, there's just been an extreme reluctance to even take advantage of some of the changes that happened under the Obama administration that would have made that more likely. And so these things didn't take off the degree that I think we all hoped. And so, I think from the U.S. sort of agricultural trade perspective directly, I don't think it's that significant of a change. I think what we're seeing now in terms of what is, particularly risky or dangerous for U.S. ag is, retaliatory or a lack of certainty from the United States for Cuba to either stop purchases or to limit purchases for core things, right? So the Cuban economy is going through, very difficult times. Obviously, feeding its population is critical, and it becomes a national security issue. And so working with partners that they know they can trust and will not either, refuse payments or, refuse to ship certain goods based on the whims of politics or hold up different elements of the transaction process, is an impediment for U.S. exporters. And, we've heard that communicated to numerous different U.S. companies that, while we haven't said explicitly, we're not purchasing from you anymore, this sort of climate of very hostile regime change, rhetoric and policies does have spillover effects. And so, we are nervous about that for the benefit of, American farmers, American producers, and everyone that's supported by them. Okay, there are a ton of questions, and I'm sorry we're not going to get to all of them. If folks have other deeper questions they want to ask, please get involved and reach out with us. On the last page of the slide, we have a contact information for email that we can pop up here in just 1 second, so you can see that. And then also, when we send around this email with the write-up of with the recording, you'll have our information via email. We are happy to be a resource to the best of our ability. We are obviously a small, nonprofit here with limited resources, so we will do the best we can to answer your questions. But again, I just want to reiterate, this is really, really an important period of time. And, make your voices heard. Get yourself, fully educated and invested, and don't sit around and wait for others to do it, because it's really going to take a collective effort to see this happen. I hope this was helpful. We tried our best here to provide you guys with resources that we hope, influence the ability for you to do your work. Thank you for everyone joining, and, please be in touch. We want to be as helpful as we can. Thank you so much for us. Appreciate it. Talk to you soon.
Thank you, everybody, for joining. Excuse me. Thank you, everybody, for joining the webinar. As a reminder, this was recorded, and we will send around the recording as soon as it is done. Please visit engagecuba.org and sign up for our regular communications, and follow us on social media channels. Thank you.